The paper was still warm from 37 different hands when Irene Baker held it up to the afternoon light and read her own name printed at the top like a verdict. "You have until Friday," Sheriff Burl Dunning said, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his weathered face that was not quite guilt, but was close enough to make Irene's stomach drop to her boots. Town council voted unanimous. The petition's been signed by every landholder in Caldwell County. Every one of them, Irene. I'm sorry. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying in front of men like Burl Dunning only gave them permission to feel better about what they were doing to you. Every landholder, she repeated, and her voice was so steady she surprised even herself. That's right. She looked at the paper again. 37 signatures. Merchants, farmers, ranchers, the Reverend, even old Mrs. Patton, who had eaten Irene's pie at every church social for 4 years and called her a blessing to the community. 37 names that all added up to the same brutal message: get out. The petition called for the seizure and resale of the Baker homestead at Sage Creek Flats on the grounds that the land had been improperly registered, following the death of her husband, Thomas Baker, 3 years prior. It was legal language for something that was not legal at all. It was a trap dressed up in ink and paper, and every soul in Caldwell County had agreed to spring it on her. Almost every soul. Because when Irene turned the paper over, scanning the wide blank margin at the bottom where more signatures could have been added, she noticed a name that was conspicuously absent. She had ridden out to all 38 landholders in the county herself, in the burning July heat of 1883, to hand-deliver notices of the council's hearing. She had looked every single one of them in the eye, and only one of them had refused to sign: Calvin Crawford. He had not explained himself. He had not been kind about it exactly. He had stood in his own doorway on the eastern edge of his vast Crawford ranch, arms crossed over a chest that looked carved from the same red rock as the mesa behind him, and he had looked at the petition in her hand and said, "No," just that, one word. No explanation offered, no apology given, no invitation to discuss it further. He had closed the door before she could form a response. She had ridden home furious, bewildered, and against all logic, unable to stop thinking about him. Now, standing in front of Sheriff Dunning with Friday looming like a cliff edge, Irene Baker made a decision that went against every practical instinct she possessed. She was going to find out why Calvin Crawford was the only man in Caldwell County who had refused to take her land, and she was going to ask him to help her fight. The story of how she had ended up here, holding that petition in a house that the town now wanted stripped from her, began 3 years earlier with a telegram and a funeral. Thomas Baker had been a good man in the way that some men are good without being particularly strong. He had loved Irene with uncomplicated warmth, had built her a house with his own hands on the 160 acres they had claimed together under the Homestead Act of 1862, and had worked the land with patient, steady devotion until the spring of 1880 when a horse threw him in the east pasture and he did not get up. He had been 31 years old. They had been married 4 years. They had no children. Irene had been 27, alone, and suddenly in possession of a homestead that men with deeper pockets and louder voices had been trying to acquire for years. Sage Creek Flats sat on the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. The creek that cut through the northern edge of her property fed into the same watershed that the 3 largest ranching operations in Caldwell County, including Crawford Ranch, depended on for their cattle. As long as Irene controlled those 160 acres, she controlled access to the most vital resource in the county. Thomas had understood this when he filed. He had been clever enough to see what the land meant and brave enough to claim it before anyone else could. After his death, Irene had received 3 formal offers to purchase the land, each one more insulting than the last. She had refused all 3. She had hired a lawyer from Wichita, a small, serious man named Arthur Greaves, who had confirmed that her title was solid and her position defensible. She had continued to work the homestead alone, hiring seasonal labor when she could afford it, living more frugally than she had thought possible, and slowly, stubbornly building something that was hers. For 3 years she had survived. And then Harlan Pruitt had arrived. Harlan Pruitt was not from Caldwell County. He had come down from Dodge City in the winter of 1882 with a saddlebag full of money and an eye for opportunity that had the cold, systematic quality of a surveyor's instrument. He was 45 years old, impeccably dressed by frontier standards, and utterly without sentiment of any kind. Within 6 months of his arrival, he had purchased 2 failing ranches, extended credit to 4 struggling merchants, and quietly made himself indispensable to the economic life of the town in a way that was less business and more architecture. By the spring of 1883, Harlan Pruitt effectively owned the debts of 31 of the 38 landholders in Caldwell County. He never raised his voice. He never made threats that were explicitly threats. He simply reminded people, in the gentle way of a man who holds all the cards, what their options were. And their options, as he presented them, inevitably included one common denominator: Irene Baker's land. Pruitt wanted Sage Creek Flats with a hunger that had moved past ambition into something that felt almost personal. He wanted the water rights, yes, but he also wanted what controlling that water would mean. With Sage Creek under his authority, every rancher in the county would need his permission to survive. He would own Caldwell County the way a man owns a watch, able to wind it or stop it at his pleasure. The petition was his idea, dressed up in the respectability of community concern. He had found a loophole in the original homestead filing, a paperwork discrepancy involving the precise date of Thomas's death relative to the annual proof of improvement submission, and had hired a Topeka attorney to argue that the filing had lapsed. It was thin, legally speaking. Arthur Greaves had told Irene it was very thin, but thin was enough to frighten 37 people who owed Pruitt money into signing their names to something that would ruin a widow who had done nothing wrong. What Irene did not yet understand, riding out toward Crawford Ranch in the golden dust of that July afternoon, was that Calvin Crawford owed Harlan Pruitt nothing. Crawford Ranch occupied the easternmost portion of Caldwell County, 4,000 acres of mixed grassland and rocky plateau that Calvin had inherited from his father at the age of 24, and spent the last 8 years building into the most productive cattle operation in the county. He had done it without credit from Pruitt, without favors from the town council, without the kind of social debt that made men into puppets. He ran his operation lean, paid his hands fair wages, and kept his business so clean that Pruitt had never found a single thread to pull. He was 32 years old, broadly built, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that watched everything with the still, measuring quality of a man who had learned early that the world revealed itself most clearly when you stayed quiet and paid attention. He had a reputation for being difficult. Irene had heard this said about him at every church social and town meeting she had attended. Too private, too independent, too unwilling to participate in the communal life of Caldwell County in the ways that were expected. What the town meant, she was beginning to understand, was that he was too unwilling to be controlled. She arrived at Crawford Ranch as the sun was dropping behind the mesa, turning the sky a deep amber that made the whole landscape look like the interior of something on fire. The ranch house was large by frontier standards, built from native limestone with a wide covered porch that faced west, and it had the solid, undecorated quality of a place where function had always been more important than appearance. Calvin Crawford was on the porch when she rode up, a coffee cup in one hand and a look on his face that was not surprise, as if he had been expecting her. "Mr. Crawford," she said, remaining on her horse because dismounting felt like conceding something she wasn't prepared to concede yet. "Mrs. Baker," his voice was low and unhurried, "you know why I'm here. I expect I do. Then you know about the petition." "I know about the petition," he confirmed. She waited for more. He offered nothing. The silence between them stretched out over the sound of cattle in a distant pasture and the low, dry wind that always blew across the flats in July. "You were the only one who didn't sign it," she said. "That's correct. I need to know why." He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing with careful precision and looked at her for a long moment. The gray eyes moved over her face with the same measuring quality she had noticed before, unhurried and thorough, as if he were reading something important in the arrangement of her features. "Come inside," he said. "This isn't a conversation for doorways." She hesitated only a moment before dismounting. The interior of the house was exactly what she would have predicted from the exterior. Clean, functional, sparsely furnished, with a large stone fireplace and walls lined with survey maps and cattle ledgers. A place where a single person had lived for a long time without requiring or expecting comfort that went beyond the practical. There was a rifle above the door and a Bible on the mantel, and a photograph on the writing desk that she glanced at without meaning to, a man and a woman older, standing in front of a homestead that looked nothing like this one. Calvin Crawford did not offer her a chair. He stood by the window and turned to face her, and the quality of directness in his expression was unusual enough that it stopped her breath for a moment. "Harlan Pruitt approached me 8 months ago," he said. "He wanted me to deed him water access rights across my eastern pasture. I refused. He told me that was a mistake I would come to regret. He told me that he was going to control every water source in this county within a year, and that anyone who wasn't on his side was going to find the position lonely and expensive." "He threatened you," Irene said. "He informed me of his intentions. There is a distinction." "Did he mention me?" Calvin looked at her steadily. "He told me that the Baker property was as good as his, that the widow wouldn't be able to hold it, and that by summer she'd either take his offer or lose it to the county." The word widow in his mouth landed differently than it did when other people used it. Not with pity, not with the slightly impatient dismissal she had grown used to. Just as a fact that had been presented to him, and that he had apparently filed away somewhere without judgment. "Is that why you didn't sign?" she asked. "Because of your dispute with Pruitt?" He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "No," he said. "Then why?" "Because what he's doing to you is wrong," Calvin Crawford said, simply and without ornamentation, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world and he couldn't quite understand why she needed him to explain it. "Your title is legal. The filing discrepancy he's exploiting is a technicality that any decent judge would throw out. What Pruitt is doing is using the financial desperation of this county to steal land from a woman who earned it. That's wrong. I won't put my name to something that's wrong." Irene had prepared herself for many possible responses. She had prepared arguments, counter-arguments, negotiations, appeals to self-interest. She had not prepared herself for this. A simple, uncomplicated statement of moral clarity from a man who was known for being difficult and who had apparently found refusing to participate in an injustice to be the easiest decision he had made all year. She felt something shift in her chest. She ignored it firmly. "If you're willing to stand against this," she said, keeping her voice professional and even, "then I need more than a refusal to sign. I need someone with standing in this county to challenge the petition legally. My lawyer in Wichita believes we can fight it, but we need a co-filer, someone who can demonstrate independent interest in the creek's legal status." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a horse moved in the corral, and the dry wind pushed dust against the window glass. "You want me to file a joint challenge," he said. "Your ranch depends on Sage Creek too," she pointed out. "If Pruitt controls those water rights, you are just as exposed as I am. You've refused his offer once. If he acquires my land, you won't be able to refuse it again. I'm aware of that. Then this protects you too. It isn't charity." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "I know it isn't charity, Mrs. Baker. I didn't think it was. Will you help me?" He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down, looked at her with those still gray eyes. "Yes," he said, "I'll help you." She rode home in the dark, and she did not examine the feeling that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs during the hour she had spent in Calvin Crawford's quiet house. She was practical enough to know that feelings born in desperation were unreliable guides, and disciplined enough to set them aside until the practical emergency was resolved. But she did not forget the way he had said, "That's wrong," with the simple certainty of a man whose compass had never been broken. The following week was a cascade of action. Arthur Greaves arrived from Wichita on the Tuesday morning stage, a small man with an enormous briefcase and the focused energy of someone who found legal combat genuinely enjoyable. Irene met him at the station and brought him directly to Crawford Ranch, where Calvin received them both with coffee and maps spread across the wide kitchen table. What emerged from 3 hours of discussion was a strategy that was elegant in its simplicity. The petition's legal basis rested entirely on the argument that the homestead filing had lapsed due to the paperwork discrepancy following Thomas's death. But Texas precedent, and Kansas territory case law following it, established that surviving spouses retained filing rights for a period of 18 months following the death of the original claimant, regardless of annual submission timing. The discrepancy Pruitt's attorney had identified was real, but it was within the protected window. The petition should never have been accepted by the county clerk in the first place. "Why did the clerk accept it?" Irene asked. Greaves and Calvin exchanged a look. "Because the clerk owes Pruitt $300, Calvin said. "Who doesn't owe Pruitt money in this county?" Irene asked, and there was bitterness in it that she hadn't intended to reveal. "A few of us," Calvin said quietly, and the way he said us pulled at something in her that she again declined to examine. The joint challenge would be filed in the Caldwell County District Court with Calvin Crawford, named as a co-plaintiff on the grounds of downstream water rights. This established his legal standing and ensured that even if the case focused primarily on the homestead filing, the water issue would be part of the record, making it harder for a local judge beholden to Pruitt to dismiss the whole thing without the decision traveling up to the district level. It was a solid plan, but it required time, and time was what Harlan Pruitt was deliberately not giving them. Thursday arrived with a new development that none of them had anticipated. Irene went to the general store for flour and salt pork and found that her account had been closed. Not overdrawn, closed, on the authority of the new credit arrangement the store owner had signed with Pruitt's banking enterprise in the spring. She had 3 days of food in the house. She had $22 in cash hidden under a floorboard, which would not go far. More critically, when she returned home, she found that the small seasonal workers she had hired to help with the summer cutting were gone. All 3 of them. They had been offered double wages by a Pruitt-affiliated ranching operation 10 miles north, effective immediately, and had left before dawn without a word. Pruitt was not waiting for Friday. He was strangling her now, methodically, cutting her off from resources and labor and credit, so that by the time the legal deadline arrived she would be too exhausted and isolated to fight effectively. Irene sat at her kitchen table with her $22 and her empty coffee pot and felt, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely afraid. She was sitting there when she heard hoofbeats. Calvin Crawford arrived at her door at 4 in the afternoon with a packhorse carrying 2 crates of provisions, followed by 2 of his own ranch hands who had apparently been briefed and were already moving toward her south pasture with fencing tools. "What are you doing?" she asked from the doorway. "Your fence on the south line is down in 2 places," he said, dismounting with the same efficient economy of movement that characterized everything he did. "If your cattle drift, you'll spend 3 days rounding them up. You don't have 3 days. You can't just ride onto someone's property and start fixing their fence. I asked you if I could help you. This is me helping you." He looked at her directly. "Unless you'd prefer to spend the next 2 days chasing cattle while Pruitt's people finish boxing you in." She stood aside and let him in. He did not treat her house with the condescension she might have expected from a man of his holdings entering a widow's modest homestead. He moved through her space with respect, setting the provisions on the kitchen table without comment on its simplicity, looking at the survey map she had pinned to the wall beside the window with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Your irrigation channels," he said, pointing to a pencil-marked line on her map. "Have you filed on those separately?" "No. You should. If Prout somehow wins on the homestead petition, your water usage rights from the channels represent a separate claim. Greaves should file an injunction on those independently." She looked at him. "How do you know about water law?" "My father lost grazing rights to a bad filing in Colorado when I was 12, he said. "I spent 6 months that winter reading every legal case he could get his hands on. By the time I was 20, I knew the water law in 4 territories by memory." This unexpected depth, the image of a 12-year-old boy reading law books by firelight to save his family's ranch, appeared in her mind with such vividness that she had to look away. "I'll tell Greaves," she said. Calvin stayed for 2 hours. His ranch hands fixed the fence and rotated her cattle away from the south pasture without being asked. He looked at her accounts, the ones she showed him, with only a brief moment of hesitation born from the particular dignity of a person who has managed alone for a long time, and made 3 observations that were precise and useful and delivered without pity. Before he left, he turned at the door, and the evening light made the angles of his face look carved and serious. "Prout will escalate," he said. "When he finds out about the joint challenge filing, he'll move to more direct pressure. On both of us. I want you to know that hasn't changed my position." "I didn't ask you to commit to anything beyond the legal filing," she said, because it was important to her that he understood she was not treating him as a protector. She was treating him as an ally, which was a different thing, a thing that required equality. He looked at her with that steady, measuring gaze. "I know you didn't," he said. "I'm telling you anyway." He rode out in the long summer evening, and Irene Baker stood in her doorway and watched him go, and admitted to herself, finally and without flinching, that what she felt watching Calvin Crawford ride away was not merely the relief of an ally secured. It was something considerably more complicated than that, and considerably more dangerous. The court hearing was set for the 14th of August. In the 3 weeks between Calvin's visit and the hearing, Caldwell County revealed itself to be exactly what Harlan Prout had made it, a closed circuit of obligation and fear. Irene's social isolation became systematic. Invitations to church socials stopped arriving. The women who had been her occasional friends began finding reasons to be occupied elsewhere when she appeared in town. The Reverend Whitmore gave a sermon about community harmony and the dangers of divisive litigation that was so transparently directed at her that 2 people turned to look at her in the pew. She sat straight-backed and did not give them the satisfaction. Calvin Crawford, meanwhile, was experiencing his own version of this pressure. 2 of his cattle buyers in Dodge City abruptly broke their purchase contracts, claiming supply changes. A water survey team appeared on the western boundary of his land, apparently commissioned by Prout's attorney to find any possible counterargument to his water rights claim. 3 members of the town council paid him a visit in the first week of August and reminded him, in terms that were dressed in neighborliness but were fundamentally a warning, that his position in Caldwell County depended on his relationships within it. He had sent them away with the same quiet firmness that characterized his refusal to sign the petition, and then had ridden to Irene's homestead to tell her about it because, as he put it, she had a right to know what was being risked on her behalf. They stood together in her kitchen again, across the table from a map that had become covered in notes and cross-references in the weeks of their collaboration, and Irene looked at him and said, "You are going to lose buyers over this. Possibly. That could cost you significantly." Yes, Calvin. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she heard herself do it and felt the slight charge of it. He noticed she could see that he noticed. "I am asking you seriously, is this worth it to you? Not the water rights, not the principle, the actual cost, because if Prout wins the hearing and retaliates, you could, Irene." Her name in his mouth was careful and deliberate, as if he had considered it before using it. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to not take it as something it isn't." She waited. "I have been watching what Harlan Pruitt has been doing to this county for 2 years," he said. "I have watched him buy obligations and manufacture need and turn neighbors into instruments. I have been waiting for the moment when someone pushed back. Not because I wanted to be some kind of symbol, but because someone had to and everyone else was too afraid." He paused. "You weren't afraid." "I was terrified," she said honestly. "You were terrified and you pushed back anyway. That's the only kind of courage that matters." He looked at the map and then back at her. "Whatever this costs me is worth it, not as charity, as something I've decided. That's all." She held his gaze for a moment that was longer than professional and shorter than the thing she would not let herself want it to be. Then she nodded and turned back to the map, and they spent the rest of the evening preparing for the hearing. But the dynamic between them had shifted, quietly and irrevocably, in the way that things between two people shift when honesty has been spoken aloud. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm that was practical in its structure and increasingly charged in its texture. Calvin rode out every other morning on the pretext of checking the shared survey markers along the creek, and on those mornings, Irene always found herself having coffee ready in a way that was not quite calculated and not quite unconscious. They talked about the case, about the county, about cattle and water and law. Gradually, because honesty had been introduced between them, they talked about other things. She learned that Calvin's parents had both died within a year of each other when he was 23, leaving him the ranch and a grief so comprehensive that he had simply buried himself in the work of building it, with no room or space for anything else. He had never married. Not because he was opposed to it, he said, with the air of a man who had examined the question at some point and set it aside rather than resolved it, but because there had not been anyone who made the idea feel real to him rather than theoretical. He said this without looking at her, which she noted. She told him about Thomas in a way she had not told anyone, not as a story of loss and struggle, but as a fuller picture. A gentle man who had loved her and given her a home and left her alone in it too soon, and the strange, complicated grief of mourning someone you had loved without being devastated. The guilt of discovering that you were, underneath the sorrow, more resilient than the loss required. Calvin listened to this with the focused, complete attention he gave to everything and said, "It isn't betrayal, you know, being able to survive." She had to take a moment before she could respond. "Some days it feels like it," she said. "Some days things feel like what they aren't," he said. "That doesn't make them what they feel like." She thought about that for a long time after he rode away. The night before the hearing, Harlan Pruitt made his last move. He arrived at Irene's door himself, alone in the 9 o'clock darkness, with his hat in his hand, and his face arranged in an expression of measured regret that was more insulting than naked hostility would have been. He told her that he admired her resilience. He told her that the hearing tomorrow was going to go badly for her, that he had the judge's ear and a team of attorneys who would make Greaves look like a schoolboy. He told her that the sensible thing, the thing that protected her future and her well-being, was to accept his purchase offer tonight before the court ruled, when she could still walk away with money in her pocket. He named a figure. It was deliberately low, meant to communicate his assessment of her desperation rather than any real valuation of the property. "And Crawford?" she asked. Something moved in Pruitt's eyes. "Crawford's involvement has been noted," he said. "He's making a mistake that this county won't forget." "He's doing the right thing," Irene said. "You have a strange relationship with that concept, Mr. Pruitt. I can see why it confuses you." His mask slipped for just a moment, and what was underneath it was ugly enough that she took an involuntary step backward. "Friday," he said. "The offer expires at noon." He left. She stood at her window watching his horse disappear into the darkness and felt the fear crystallizing in her chest into something harder and more useful. Not courage, exactly. Determination. The kind that comes from having nothing left to lose and therefore no reason to be careful. She arrived at the Caldwell County courthouse the next morning in her best dress, the dark blue wool that was too warm for August but communicated the seriousness she intended, with Arthur Greaves at her right side and Calvin Crawford at her left. The courthouse was small and smelled of pine resin and old paper. Half the town seemed to have come to watch. She walked through the crowd with her eyes straight ahead and her back very straight, and she heard the whispers moving around her like water around stone, and she did not turn. Calvin's hand touched her elbow briefly as they moved through the door, not holding, just a point of contact, a steadiness offered and accepted in the span of 2 seconds. She did not look at him, but she felt it. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Greaves was not a schoolboy. He was a precise, relentless advocate who had clearly spent the past 3 weeks doing nothing but preparing for this moment. He presented the territorial precedent on surviving spouse filing rights, the irrigation channel injunction documentation, 3 independent survey assessments of the creek's relationship to both properties, and a detailed historical record of every annual improvement submission Irene had made since Thomas's death, all of which had been accepted without objection until Pruitt's attorney had manufactured one. Pruitt's team pushed back hard. They were aggressive and experienced and had clearly been well paid. But the law was what it was, and Greaves had it in both hands. Calvin took the stand and spoke about water rights and creek dependency with a precise, documented authority that silenced even Pruitt's lawyers for several minutes. He produced surveys, historical usage records, and a letter from the Kansas Territorial Surveyor's Office that corroborated the creek's legal status in terms that were, as Greaves quietly noted to Irene, extremely difficult to argue against. The judge, a man named Aldridge from Newton who had not had the opportunity to be purchased by Pruitt, deliberated for 40 minutes. He ruled in Irene's favor on all counts. The filing discrepancy was within the protected window. The petition was legally void. The irrigation channel injunction was granted, and Crawford's water rights co-filing was acknowledged as valid, establishing a joint record that would make any future attempt to acquire either property through similar means considerably more difficult. Harlan Pruitt left the courthouse without speaking. His face was a flat, controlled surface that revealed nothing. But the attorney who walked beside him was talking very fast in a low, urgent voice, and 2 of the signatures on the petition, Irene noticed, had already slipped out of the room before the ruling was fully announced. Irene stood on the courthouse steps in the August sun with Greaves and Calvin and felt the relief moving through her like water after a drought, so comprehensive and physical that she had to press her hand against the doorframe for a moment. "You held it," Greaves said warmly, shaking her hand. "I must say, Mrs. Baker, you are one of the most formidable clients I have ever had the pleasure of representing." "The case was solid," she said. "The case was solid because you built it solid," he said. 3 years of meticulous record-keeping, every improvement logged and dated, every filing submitted on time. Pruitt thought he was dealing with a grieving widow who had let things slide. "He was wrong about you," she smiled at him. She turned to Calvin, who was standing slightly apart with his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression that was quietly, intensely glad. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for everything he had risked and everything he had offered and the way he had looked at her in her kitchen and said, "You weren't afraid." "Don't thank me," he said. "You'd have won without me." "I might have won the case," she said. "I wouldn't have won it whole." He looked at her for a long moment in the clean August sunlight, and something in the air between them settled into a new configuration, the way land settles after rain, different from before in ways that are permanent. "I'd like to ride out with you," he said carefully. "Back to your place, if that's all right." "It's all right," she said. They rode back to Sage Creek Flats in the mid-afternoon, side by side on the long road that cut through the county's mixed grassland, and talked the way people talk when an emergency has just passed and left them both slightly giddy and uncertain what to do with their hands. They talked about what would happen next with Pruitt, whether he would regroup or cut his losses. They talked about the fall cattle season and the irrigation expansion she had been planning for 2 years. They talked about books, which surprised them both into a shared delight, because neither had expected the other to be a reader and both were. When they arrived at the homestead, Irene made coffee and they sat on her porch in the cooling afternoon, and the conversation went quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable, but was full of things neither of them had said yet. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Yes." "When you stood in your doorway and I handed you that petition," she said, "you said no without any hesitation. Most people would have at least read the document first." "I knew what was in it," he said. "Pruitt had told me his plan. But still, one word, door closed, no explanation offered." She looked at him sideways. "I was furious with you. I thought you were just being difficult." The corner of his mouth moved. "I get that a lot. I came out here expecting to argue with you," she said. "I had a whole speech prepared. Reasons why your self-interest aligned with refusing. Statistics about the water dependency." "What happened to the speech?" "You said because what he's doing to you is wrong," she said, "and then I couldn't remember any of it." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the creek line where it caught the late afternoon light between the cottonwood trees. "I owe you something honest," he said. She waited. "I've known who you were for 2 years," he said. "Not personally. I've seen you in town, at the general store, at the church. I knew what you'd been doing out here alone after your husband died, and I knew what Pruitt was building toward, and I knew you were going to be in the center of it." He paused. "I've been trying to think of a legitimate reason to ride over here and introduce myself for about 18 months. Irene turned her head to look at him fully. He was looking at the creek, color touching the back of his neck in a way that was endearing on a man of his general reserve. "You could have just ridden over," she said. "That's not how I'm made," he said. "I know," she said softly. "I can see that." The silence held something tender in it now, something that had been building across weeks of coffee and maps and courtrooms, and the particular closeness of two people fighting a common enemy side by side. "I am not the easiest company," he said, which struck her as both accurate and completely beside the point. "I am not looking for easy," she said. "I have been managing a homestead alone for 3 years. Easy is not something I have been trained to expect." He turned to look at her then fully, and the gray eyes were no longer measuring or still. They were open, in the way eyes are open when a person has decided to stop being careful. "Irene," he said. "Calvin," she said. "I would like to know if there is any possibility," he started, and then stopped, apparently finding that formal construction inadequate for what he was trying to say. She took pity on him because she was braver in some ways than he was, and because the afternoon light was doing something to the moment that she did not want to waste. "Yes," she said, "there is a possibility." The first time he reached across the porch railing and took her hand, it was not dramatic. It was not a grand gesture. It was simply his large, warm hand finding hers in the evening air, and the feeling of it was so right and so solid that she held on without thinking and knew, in the way that rare things make themselves known, that this was real. They sat on her porch until the stars came out over the Sage Creek flats, talking, holding hands with the careful attention of people to whom touch has been important and rare, and did not remark on the fact that this was not how either of them had expected the day to end. 3 weeks later, Harlan Pruitt left Caldwell County. He did not announce his departure. He simply failed to appear at the bank one Tuesday morning, and by that afternoon it emerged that he had liquidated his more portable assets over the preceding week and boarded a train to Topeka. He left behind a collection of outstanding debt contracts that were legally valid but whose enforcement was now in the hands of a county that had watched his methods exposed in open court and had no enthusiasm for continuing his project. The Caldwell County Bank, freed from the atmosphere of fear that Pruitt had cultivated, extended its own credit restructuring to 6 of the families whose debts Pruitt had held, making the transition manageable rather than catastrophic. It was not a perfect resolution. 3 of the families who had signed the petition came to Irene in the months that followed, separately and with varying degrees of awkwardness, to apologize. She received these apologies with the measured grace of someone who understood that fear makes cowards of people who are not essentially cowardly. She forgave them, not because she was required to, but because the county was where she lived, and she was not interested in carrying grudges across the landscape of the rest of her life. Some of them she forgave more readily than others. The Reverend was the hardest. She had expected more from a man of faith. She told him so, quietly, one October Sunday after the service, and watched him have the dignity to be ashamed of himself. That was enough for her. The autumn that followed the hearing was the finest Irene Baker had experienced in Caldwell County. The irrigation expansion she had been planning for 2 years became possible now, with the financial breathing room that Pruitt's departure created, and the professional support that Calvin offered, not money. He had understood without being told that she would not take money, but labor and expertise, and the shared use of equipment that moved the project from aspiration to reality in 6 weeks of intensive work. The expanded channels brought water to 12 additional acres, which she planted with winter wheat before the first frost. She hired 2 permanent hands, a serious young man named Ezra who had worked the cattle routes and wanted to settle, and an older woman named Ruth who was the best kitchen and garden hand she had ever seen, and who treated the whole homestead with a proprietary fondness that Irene found deeply comforting. And Calvin Crawford rode out every 2 or 3 days, never staying so long as to impose, and never staying so briefly as to seem merely dutiful. And the 2 of them built something that was not measured in land or water rights, but in conversations and shared meals, and the particular warmth of 2 people who have each lived alone long enough to know what it means to have someone who wants to be where you are. He courted her with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything else. There were no grand romantic gestures because he was not built for grand gestures, and she had learned by now that she was not built to receive them comfortably anyway. What he brought was attention, the focused, complete quality of attention that asked how the wheat was coming, and remembered what she had said 3 weeks earlier about wanting to expand the chicken run, and noticed when she was tired before she said so, and once, without comment, showed up on a Tuesday morning with new hinges for the barn door that had been squeaking for a month, and fixed it without being asked. She brought him things in return, because this was not a one-sided arrangement, and she was careful that it didn't become one. She went to his ranch twice a week to help with the ranch accounts, which were accurate but disorganized in a way that was costing him small amounts of money through inefficiency. She found a bookkeeping system that suited his style and taught it to him, and in the process, learned the full scope of what Crawford Ranch represented: 4,000 acres of thoughtfully managed land, healthy cattle, well-paid hands, and the financial solidity of a man who had built something real without cutting corners. She found herself proud of him in a way that was warm and uncomplicated, and recognized that as a good sign. He kissed her for the first time on a November afternoon in the cottonwood grove along the creek, where the last leaves were coming down gold and amber in a light breeze, and it had been preceded by a conversation about water flow rates that had somehow migrated into a conversation about what she wanted her future to look like, and then a silence that had gone a different direction entirely. It was not her first kiss, but it was the first one that felt like the beginning of something, rather than the continuation of something else. She walked home through the cottonwoods with the afternoon light in her hair and a feeling in her chest like the first day of spring, and decided that she was not going to be sensible about this. Being sensible had served her well for 3 years. She had been sensible through Thomas's death, and through Pruitt's campaign, and through every hardship that frontier life had placed in her path. She had been so sensible that it had sometimes felt like a cage. Calvin Crawford was not sensible, she thought, and was surprised to find herself smiling at the idea. He was principled and thorough and formidably capable and entirely unwilling to do things that were wrong, but the reason he had stood in his doorway and said no when 37 other people said yes was not sensible. It was something fiercer and more essential than sensible, and she wanted to be close to that quality for the rest of her life. She had not made a decision. She had recognized something. There is a difference. He came to dinner the following Sunday for the first time. A proper dinner at her table with the good plates that had been Thomas's, mother's, and candles she had kept for an occasion she hadn't been able to imagine until now. Ruth had made a roast and gone home early with the tact of someone who understood perfectly well what the evening was. Calvin arrived in a clean shirt and with his hair actually cut, which she noted with a private warmth, and brought a bottle of wine he had apparently acquired from the hotel in town, which was not his usual behavior and indicated a level of intention that made her heart do something complicated. They ate and talked, and the conversation moved through everything and nothing: the county's slow economic recovery, a book she had recommended to him 2 months earlier that he had finally read and had strong opinions about, the hawk that had been hunting her chicken yard, the letter she had received from her sister in Ohio. They did not talk about the future, not explicitly, because neither of them had the habit of declaring things prematurely. But the future sat at the table with them, warm and patient, willing to wait for the right moment. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the cold November air wrapped in coats and talked more quietly, the voices you use when the night is still, and Calvin said, in the tone of a man who has thought carefully about how to say something, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that if the answer is no, nothing changes between us." "Ask me," she said. "I've been thinking about what this is," he said. "What we've been building, and I think you've been thinking about it too." "Yes," she said. "I'm not a man who talks around things," he said. "I'm aware that it's fast by some measures. I'm aware that I am not the simplest person to know." "Calvin." "What?" "You just described yourself as not the simplest person to know," she said. "And I have spent the last 5 months knowing you fairly extensively. I think I am in a position to make my own assessment." The quiet sound he made was almost a laugh. "And I think you are the most straightforward person I have ever met," she said. "You just express it differently than most people expect. It's not complicated at all once you know the language." He was quiet for a moment in the best way, the way that meant something had landed somewhere true. "Irene," he said, "I would like to marry you." She looked at him in the cold blue starlight with the cottonwoods moving at the edge of the creek and the smell of frost on the air, and her whole life spread out in front of her in the particular way it spreads when you are about to make a choice that organizes everything. "I would like that too," she said. He reached over and took her hand in his warm, steady grip, and they sat with that settled between them like a stone placed carefully in the right position, and did not feel the need to say anything else for a long time. They were married in March of 1884, which was later than Calvin would have preferred and earlier than Irene had originally intended, but which turned out to be exactly right. The wedding was small by the standards of Caldwell County, but not small by the standards of what either of them wanted. The Reverend Whitmore officiated, which Irene had agreed to with the particular grace of a woman who has forgiven someone and means it, and which Calvin accepted with more equanimity than she had expected, until she realized that Calvin's relationship to institutions was always governed by their function rather than their symbolism. Ruth made the wedding cake. Ezra stood as Calvin's witness with the solid dignity of a young man who took his role seriously. Arthur Greaves came down from Wichita for the occasion and spent most of the reception talking to an elderly county judge about water rights, which was apparently his idea of a celebration. Irene wore a dress she had made herself from a deep ivory muslin, simple and well-fitted, with her dark hair pinned up with the small pearl combs that had been her mother's. Calvin, in a dark jacket and clean white shirt, looked at her when she walked toward him with the complete, unguarded expression of a man who has stopped being careful and is not sorry about it. She reached him and took his hands and felt the warmth of them and thought, "Here, this is the place." The vows were traditional. She meant every word. They moved Irene's things into the ranch house that spring, a process that was more negotiated than she had expected, because they both had strong opinions about how space should be organized, and discovering this about each other was both amusing and occasionally tense and ultimately productive. Her books joined his on the study shelves and made the room look, as Calvin noted, like something had come alive in it. Her kitchen instincts and Ruth's practical genius transformed what had been an efficient but austere space into something that smelled like cedar and baking bread, and actually invited a person to sit down. Irene kept the homestead. This was important to her, and Calvin had not questioned it for a second, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. The 160 acres at Sage Creek Flats remained in her name, managed now as an extension of Crawford Ranch but legally and sentimentally hers. The land Thomas had claimed and she had defended and would not release. She planted additional wheat there in the spring and hired Ezra to manage the day-to-day operations with a small additional crew, and it produced well from the first full season under the new management. The combination of her years of careful soil work and the enhanced irrigation proving exactly as effective as she had projected. Sage Creek ran clear and full that spring, the cottonwoods coming out along its banks in the tender green of new season, and Irene stood beside it one April morning with the sunrise on the water and understood that this was what it meant to have fought for something and won. Not triumph exactly, something quieter and deeper. The particular piece of a thing that belongs to you because you earned it at the proper cost. By summer she knew she was expecting. She told Calvin on a June evening on the porch, directly and without preamble, because she was not built for elaborate revelations, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions in about 3 seconds that she later described to Ruth as the most readable she had ever seen him. He stood up, sat back down, said, "Are you certain?" And when she said yes, he reached for her hands with the careful attention of a man handling something precious, and his face settled into a gladness that was so comprehensive and so quiet that she felt tears come to her eyes before she could prevent them. "I didn't think I was going to have this," he said, low and private. "I know," she said. "Neither did I. Are you well?" he asked, which was the most Calvin Crawford question she could have imagined, and which made her laugh despite the tears. "I am very well," she said. "I'm going to be very well." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his warmth in the June evening, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the most perfect silence she had ever sat in. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the middle of a snowstorm that made the road to town impassable and required Ruth to serve as midwife with the focused competence she brought to every task. He was a healthy, loud, furiously alive baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and Calvin held him for the first time with the expression of a man who has discovered a territory he did not know existed and intends to explore every inch of it. They named him Thomas, for the man who had claimed the land, and James, for Calvin's father. Thomas James Crawford arrived in the world in a snowstorm and announced himself to it with considerable volume, which Ruth declared was a good sign. Calvin's relationship with his son was one of the things Irene had not known to anticipate, and which she found repeatedly astonishing. The same quality of focused, complete attention that he brought to everything else, the creek surveys and the cattle accounts, and the way he listened when she spoke, he brought to the baby with a thoroughness that melted her at unexpected moments. He was not a man who talked around things, and so he talked to Thomas directly, explaining the cattle and the water and the land as if the baby understood, which Thomas clearly appreciated based on the quality of his attention in return. When Thomas was 6 months old, Irene started teaching school. This had been a plan forming since the previous winter, born from the recognition that Caldwell County's children were poorly served by its existing educational arrangements, which amounted to a 6-month session in a converted storage room with a teacher who changed every year and whose qualifications varied widely. She had a better education than most women in the county, and a talent for explanation that she had discovered during the months of working with Calvin on his accounts, and she had the particular stubbornness required to turn a plan into a reality. Calvin had supported this without reservation, which had been her one real anxiety. She had prepared an argument. She had organized her reasoning. She had not needed any of it. "Of course," he had said, when she presented the idea with the careful thoroughness of someone expecting resistance, "you've been wasted on wheat." She had stared at him for a moment and then started laughing, and he had looked pleased with himself in the quiet way that meant he had surprised her intentionally. The school opened in September 1885, in a proper building that the town funded with the recovered confidence of a community, no longer hemorrhaging its resources into Pruitt's enterprise. Irene taught 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and discovered that teaching was one of the things she was best at in a way that felt like recognition rather than discovery. She also discovered, that first winter, that she was expecting again. The second pregnancy was easier, or perhaps she was more at ease with herself and with the life she had built, which amounts to the same thing. Calvin was attentive in the ways that had become familiar, steadily present without being hovering, managing the domestic load with Ezra and Ruth during the weeks when she was most tired without requiring her to ask him to. Their daughter was born in June of 1886, in the summer warmth with the creek running high from the spring rains and the wheat on the homestead standing green and tall. She was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter from the first hour, with dark eyes that moved around the room with an alertness that made Ruth say she was going to be a thinker. They named her Eleanor, for Irene's mother and Grace, because Calvin had said it quietly while holding her and looking at his wife and the newness of the life they had built, and it had seemed right. Thomas Crawford, age 1 year and 4 months, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone encountering a new territory, and decided, over the course of 2 days, to become her devoted protector. Irene found this so sweet and so quintessentially Calvin's son that she had to step outside for a moment to compose herself. The years that followed built themselves out of the same materials, work and love, and the seasons moving over the land in their ancient cycle. Calvin expanded the ranch's eastern operations with a second cattle drive operation that Ezra managed with growing skill and confidence. The water rights that he and Irene had jointly defended became the foundation of a county water cooperative, proposed by Calvin at a town council meeting in 1887, and ratified by the same 37 landholders who had signed Pruitt's petition, older now and more honest about what they had done, and more committed to the kind of community that did not repeat it. Irene's school grew. She added a second classroom and persuaded the county to fund a second teacher, a young woman from Lawrence named Clara who was brilliant and methodical, and who fell entirely in love with the high, dry beauty of Caldwell County and stayed. Together they established a curriculum that was more serious and more ambitious than anything the county had previously provided, and the children who passed through it carried something forward that was harder to measure than arithmetic but more important in the long run. Harlan Pruitt's name surfaced occasionally over the years, in newspapers from Topeka or Wichita, where his various enterprises rose and collapsed with the regularity of a man who preyed on vulnerability and periodically encountered something with teeth. He never returned to Caldwell County. Irene did not think about him often. When she did, she thought of him as she would think of a storm that had done real damage but had ultimately passed, leaving the land different and in some ways stronger than it had been before. The petition, the physical document with its 37 signatures and its blank margin where Calvin's name was not, she kept in the locked box where she kept Thomas Baker's death certificate and Eleanor's birth record and the survey deed for Sage Creek Flats. She kept it not as a monument to injustice, but as a reminder that the world has fracture lines, and that where you stand at those moments is the most important thing about you. She had stood in her kitchen alone with $22 and her courage, and she had made a decision to fight. He had stood in his doorway with one word and an unbreakable sense of what was right. That was where they had begun, and everything that followed had grown from that beginning with the patient, inexorable logic of a creek running toward its watershed. In the autumn of 1888, when Thomas was 3 and Alina was 2, and the evening light over the mesa was the deep amber of high October, Irene sat on the porch of the ranch house that had become entirely her home and watched Calvin come in from the east pasture on his gray horse, riding easy in the saddle with the relaxed efficiency of a man who has spent his life on horseback. Thomas was asleep inside. Alina was on the porch beside Irene, engaged with concentrated seriousness in the project of sorting pebbles by size. Calvin saw Irene from 50 yards out, and the expression that moved across his face at that distance was visible and uncomplicated, the particular gladness of a man coming home. He dismounted at the corral fence, handed off the horse to one of the hands, came up the porch steps, and kissed the top of Alina's head and then Irene's mouth in the easy sequence of a man for whom these are the two most natural movements in the world. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he confirmed, settling into the chair beside her. "The northeast herd is in better shape than the survey suggested. We'll have a strong spring count. I finished the school board proposal," she said. "I want to add a third classroom next year. Tell them to talk to me about the lumber. I know a man in Newton who owes me a favor." She smiled at him sidelong. "What?" he said. "I was thinking about the day I rode out to your door with that petition," she said. He looked at her with the slight smile that was his version of fullness. "You were furious," he said. "I was furious," she agreed. "I had a whole speech." "You mentioned the speech." "You said one word and closed the door," she said. "It was enough." "I know," she said. "That's what I was thinking about. It was enough." Alina held up a pebble for their collective inspection, gray and round, and apparently representing some kind of achievement in the sorting project. Calvin examined it with serious attention. "Excellent," he told his daughter, which satisfied her completely. Irene watched this exchange with the feeling she had learned to identify over 4 years as the specific quality of a life that is right, not perfect, because nothing is perfect and perfection was never what she had wanted. But right in the way that things are right when they have been built with good materials, by people who were honest with each other. The creek ran along the property line of the homestead and down through the eastern pasture of Crawford Ranch and out into the watershed that fed the whole county, as it had always run and would keep running, doing what water does, finding the low places and filling them, moving through the landscape with patient, necessary persistence. She had held that land. He had stood at her door. That was the beginning. Everything that came after, the years of work and partnership, and 2 children and a school, and a county water cooperative, and the slow, steady knitting of 2 solitary people into something that was stronger and warmer than either had been alone. Everything that came after had grown from that one word. Number said not because of water rights or self-interest or any of the practical reasons she had been prepared to argue. Said because the thing being done to her was wrong, and he was not the kind of man who put his name to things that were wrong. She had learned, over 4 years of knowing him, that this was the most fundamental fact about Calvin Crawford. He was not built for heroics or declarations or grand romantic gestures. He was built for the quiet, daily, unbreakable practice of integrity, for doing the right thing when no one was watching, and especially when everyone else was doing the wrong one. It turned out that this was exactly what love looked like, when you stopped waiting for it to look like something else. The October light went gold and then amber, and then the deep rose of evening, and Alina fell asleep on the porch between them with her pebbles sorted into their careful rows, and Calvin reached over and took Irene's hand in his warm, familiar grip. And inside the house, Thomas slept in his small bed dreaming whatever 3-year-olds dream, and the creek ran on its way through the dark, and the land held everything it had always held. And Irene Baker Crawford sat in the last light of a perfect day and felt, with absolute certainty, that she was home. Not the house, though the house was hers. Not the land, though the land was hers in the way that nothing you haven't fought for can ever fully be yours. Not even the man beside her, though he was hers in the way that matters most, in the way of mutual choosing, of two people who had looked at each other clearly and said yes. Home was this, the feeling of having been seen and having chosen to be seen, and having it be worth the risk every single day. She leaned her head against Calvin's shoulder in the October evening, and he put his arm around her, and a leaner slept between them, and the stars came out one by one over the Sage Creek flats. The Petition was in a box in the study. The creek ran clean. The children were growing. Everything that had been broken had been set right. Everything that had been taken had been reclaimed. And the only man in Caldwell County who had refused to take her land was holding her hand in the dark, and she loved him so thoroughly and so well that the feeling of it had stopped being separate from the feeling of being alive. Outside, the last cottonwood leaves came down gold in the night wind, and the land held still, and everything was exactly as it should be.